There are wounds no one ever sees, not because you hide them well, but because they have no shape, no voice. They don't scream the way grief does. They don't bleed like heartbreak. They just linger, quiet as dust on a forgotten shelf inside your chest. Maybe you've known that kind of pain, the kind that lives in silence. Life outside goes on as if nothing happened. You go to work. You smile in the hallway. You answer messages. You laugh at the right cues. And still, something inside you no longer moves. It's not sadness. It's something stranger. Emptiness. A hollow space where something used to be. A presence. A heartbeat. A feeling. You don't even know when it disappeared. Only that now, when you reach for it, there's nothing there, and no one notices. But you do, every day, in small, quiet ways. Do you remember the last time you looked in the mirror and couldn't quite recognize the person staring back? Not because you forgot your name, but because something deeper, something essential had gone missing. You keep asking yourself silently, when did I start feeling like a ghost inside my own life? They didn't come to love you. Not truly. They came to break you. Not out of cruelty. Not even by choice. But because their role in your life was never about comfort, it was about interruption. You met them, and something inside you lit up, didn't it? It felt like fate. Like a missing part had finally returned. They said something, or maybe said nothing at all. And still, you felt seen, in a way you couldn't explain. And then they shattered you, not just your heart, but your identity. Like a fault line, splitting through every version of yourself you had ever believed in. You stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped trusting the voice in your own head. You weren't just grieving a relationship. You were grieving the self you once were and could no longer find. But what if that was the point? Carl Jung once suggested that some people are sent into our lives not to complete us, but to awaken us. An awakening rarely feels like light. It feels like fire. It strips you. It rips through illusion. It exposes the architecture of your soul, the parts built on longing, on pain, on the hope that someone else might one day make you whole. They weren't the love of your life. They were the earthquake, the mirror sent to crack, the symbol sent to rise. Because sometimes the person who hurts you the most is the only one who could have reached the part of you that was still asleep. Their love didn't heal you. Their leaving did. They were never meant to stay. They were meant to burn everything false. You thought it was love. It felt like love. It moved like love. It consumed like love. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something far more dangerous and far more necessary? Carl Jung believed that we don't fall in love with people. We fall in love with the unclaimed parts of ourselves they awaken. We project not consciously, but from the deep well of our psyche, the images we've carried since childhood. The ones shaped by absence, by longing, by the silent ache to be chosen, seen, rescued. And when someone walks into our lives who reflects just the right light, our unconscious whispers, "There, that's them, that's the one." But they're not the one. They're the mirror. They don't actually hold the things we see in them. They simply reflect them back at us. The warmth you felt wasn't just theirs. It was yours. The feeling of being seen. That was your own soul recognizing itself. The magic wasn't in their touch. It was in the part of you that finally stirred awake when they arrived. You called it connection, but it was a reunion with yourself. And so you loved them, fiercely, blindly, desperately, not because of who they were, but because of how you felt when you stood in their presence, alive, chosen, whole. You mistook that spark for truth. But Jung warned us, projection feels divine because it comes from the most unconscious parts of us. You weren't just looking at them, you were looking at your own soul in costume. The tragedy is this: no one can live up to the myth your wounds create. No one can carry the burden of being your missing piece. So when the cracks began to show, when they stopped reflecting your light, when their flaws became too visible to ignore, the illusion shattered, and you weren't just heartbroken. You were unmasked. You didn't just lose them. You lost the version of you that only existed through their gaze. And maybe that's why it hurt so much. Because what you really wanted wasn't their love. It was to finally believe you were worthy of it. When they left or withdrew slowly, like a tide pulling away from the shore, it didn't just leave you alone. It left you exposed. Not to them, to yourself. You began to feel things that words couldn't quite name. Like how fragile your self-worth had become. Like how much of your identity was built in the shape of their attention. Like how terrified you were of the silence they left behind. And in that silence, a truth emerged. Sharp, relentless, unavoidable. You hadn't just loved them. You had needed them to feel real. Their absence wasn't just a loss. It was a revelation. You saw the versions of yourself you had built just to be loved. The pleasing, the performing, the quiet shape-shifting in hopes of staying chosen. And when all of that failed, when none of it made them stay, you were left standing there, stripped of every role, naked, honest, unprotected, and maybe, for the first time, real. Jung believed that consciousness does not come gently. It rises through collapse, through grief, through disillusionment. And that's what this rupture was, not just the end of a relationship, but the breaking open of a shell you didn't even know you were living in. The pain was not punishment. It was precision, a divine scalpel cutting away the false, the inherited, the unconscious patterns wrapped around your truth. They didn't destroy you. They destroyed who you thought you had to be to earn love. And in the quiet that followed, you met someone you hadn't met in a long time, or perhaps ever. Yourself. Not the curated self, not the charming, smiling, agreeable self, but the one who had been waiting beneath it all. The self that was never chosen by them, but was always waiting to be chosen by you. You may have called it betrayal. You may have felt it in your bones, like something sacred had been torn away too soon. Like the universe had promised you everything only to laugh as it slipped through your fingers. You wondered, how could something that felt so divine end with so much silence? How could someone who felt like home walk away like a stranger? But what if they weren't the betrayal? What if they were the reflection, the mirror so precise, so unrelenting, that it could only show you what you refused to see? Jung wrote that the people who enter our lives with the most intensity are often not people at all, but symbols. They don't come to stay, they come to shake. They are the catalysts, the myth bearers, the archetypes dressed in skin. They are not your person. They are your turning point, because something ancient moves through these collisions. Something not of logic, but of soul. They came bearing the fire. And that fire did not warm you, it burned. Through the walls you built. Through the dreams you borrowed. Through the beliefs you never questioned. They came not to heal your wounds, but to name them. To make them undeniable. To hold your shadow up to the light and say, this too is you. And yes, it felt like loss. But maybe it was the beginning of wholeness. Maybe you were never meant to walk forever with them. Maybe their role was to remind you that the love you were searching for was not in their arms, but in your return to yourself. You begged for them to stay. But staying would have meant staying asleep. And they They were sent to wake you. You thought they shattered your world. But what if all they shattered was the illusion that someone else could be your world? There is a kind of pain that doesn't just ache, it unravels. It doesn't come with loud goodbyes or sharp words. It arrives in the quiet. In the mornings when their name still sits on your tongue, but your lips forget how to say it. In the nights when you reach across the bed out of habit only to grasp the weight of emptiness. That's not just heartbreak. That's the death of a fantasy, because the person you loved, maybe they were never fully real. Not in the way you imagined. Not in the way your soul dressed them in meaning. You didn't fall in love with them. You fell in love with the story they allowed you to tell yourself. The story where someone finally saw you, finally chose you, finally stayed. But they didn't stay. And so the story collapsed. And with it, the version of you who had built their worth around being loved by someone else. That death, it feels like a kind of dying. And in a way, it is. It's the funeral of the mask, the burial of the dream. But underneath all of that loss, something else begins to stir. Something older than your stories. Something more honest than your need to be understood. Yourself. Not the self you became to survive. Not the self that learned how to earn affection by being small, quiet, perfect, but the self that simply is, the one who does not need to be chased or chosen to matter, the one who has always been waiting beneath the ache. Jung called this process individuation, the slow, painful peeling away of everything false until the soul stands whole and unhidden, and it begins always with the collapse. The illusion has to die before the self can live. So mourn them if you must. Mourn the memories, the hopes, the future that never came. But don't forget to honor what was born in their absence, because the moment they left, you stopped being the person who needed them to stay. And that was your beginning. We are taught to avoid breaking, to hold it together, to smile politely through despair, to grip the pieces tightly as if the shattering of the ego means the death of who we are. But Jung saw it differently. He believed that when the ego cracks, the soul finally has a voice. Because the ego, it is just a mask. It's the character you play, the roles, the titles, the polished replies. It is built from fear, from memory, from what the world told you you had to be in order to belong. And when someone leaves you in pieces, when the script no longer works and the performance no longer saves you, you're left with something terrifying and real. Yourself without the armor. Not the version that people applaud, not the version you curated, but the raw, unfiltered soul that exists underneath all the trying. It speaks in silence, not noise, in stillness, not striving, but you can't hear it until everything else falls away, until the heartbreak is deep enough to split the shell, until the absence is loud enough to drown out the story you were telling yourself about who you had to be. And that's what they did. They were the one who, perhaps without knowing, cracked your ego open. Not gently, not cleanly, but completely. You begged the universe for clarity, for purpose, for awakening. And the universe sent you them, not as a blessing wrapped in warmth, but as a disruption that burned through every illusion you didn't know you were clinging to. And in that fire, you didn't just lose them. You lost the self that was built around being loved by them. You lost the person who thought love had to be earned, the one who thought wholeness lived in someone else's eyes. And as painful as that death was, it made room for something far more holy. A self who no longer bends to be accepted, a self who no longer begs to be seen, a self that no longer fears the breaking. Because now you understand, the soul does not arrive in perfection, it arrives in pieces. You were told love would save you, in stories, in movies, in whispered dreams. You were promised that love would be the light that made the darkness disappear. But that's not how the soul works, and that's not what love is for. Love was never meant to complete you. It was meant to reflect where you still abandon yourself. And so, when they came into your life, it felt like the story you'd been writing in your head had finally arrived in flesh. You weren't just seen, you were lit from the inside. You weren't just touched, you were transformed. But when they left, or stopped trying, or stayed, but only halfway, you began to crumble, because they had become your mirror, your meaning, your permission to feel alive. Without them, you didn't just feel lonely, you felt lost. And that feeling, though unbearable, was the medicine. It was the confrontation you didn't know you needed. Jung believed that what we call love is often just the soul-seeking reunion with itself. We project, we idolize, we pour our longing into another, and then we wonder why they can't hold it. They weren't supposed to, because no one, no matter how magical, no matter how aligned, can carry the weight of the parts of you that you have refused to love yourself. The love you seek is not in their hands. It is in your own. And when they walked away, you were left not with their absence, but with your own. The silence wasn't theirs. It was yours, echoing back to you, all the places inside you that still whispered, I am not enough without them. But now you know, you were never meant to be completed. You were meant to remember that you were never broken to begin with. They didn't fail you. They fulfilled their purpose to show you that healing doesn't come through being chosen. It comes the moment you choose yourself. Grief changes you, not just how you feel, but how you see. When someone you once loved becomes a ghost in your life, you start to notice everything differently. The way silence now hums like a language. The way certain songs feel like memories you never wrote. The way your own reflection begins to shift, not because your face has changed, but because the story behind your eyes is no longer the same. This is not ordinary grief. This is initiation. You're not just mourning a person. You're mourning the version of you who believed love would save you. You're grieving the dream that someone else could make the ache go away. And underneath that, you're saying goodbye to the comfort of not knowing who you really are. Jung believed that true awakening begins at the edge of the unconscious, and most of us only get there through loss. Because pain is the language the soul listens to. When joy whispers, we smile. When pain screams, we listen. We stop pretending. We stop performing. We drop the mask not out of courage, but because it no longer fits the face beneath it. This is what grief does. It strips. And what remains is not just a wounded heart, it is a self finally unguarded. You begin to see love differently, not as something to find, but something to become. And you begin to understand why they had to leave. Because if they had stayed, you would have kept building your identity in their shadow. You would have never stepped fully into the light of your own becoming. They were never the ending. They were the threshold. They were the question the universe asked you in a voice that sounded like theirs. Who are you without them? And the answer is still unfolding. But now you are walking toward it, not in pieces, but in presence. Not trying to get them back, but trying to get yourself back. And that is rebirth. You thought it was the end, the collapse, the silence, the unbearable ache. It felt like life had torn a page from your soul and left it unfinished. But maybe you were never broken. Maybe you were blooming. Becoming isn't always soft. Sometimes it starts in the wreckage, in the spaces where nothing feels familiar anymore, where the mirrors no longer reflect who you thought you were. And it's there in that raw, unlit space that the real you begins to breathe. Not the version you shaped for love, not the one who bent to be chosen, but the self beneath all of that. The self who had been waiting patiently, silently, for everything false to fall away. You did not need to be completed. You needed to be remembered, and grief was the remembering. Loss was the doorway. Heartbreak was the teacher. They didn't save you because it was never their role. They cracked you open so that you could finally save yourself. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's what you've done. You walked through the dark. Not around it, not over it, but through. And though you may still ache, you're no longer asleep. You are awake now. Not just to pain, but to truth. To the quiet strength of your own presence. To the stillness that no longer frightens you. Because now, you know you were never meant to find yourself in someone else's eyes. You were always meant to return to your own. So if you still think of them, sometimes, if the memories still sting, that's okay. Let them rise. But let them rise as reminders not of what you lost, but of how far you've come. They were not your ending. They were your beginning. You are not what shattered. You are what survived. You are not unfinished. You are unfolding. And you are not broken. You were becoming all along.